And then when we got over that worry, we were worried that you wouldn't come back. So we're delighted to see all of you again tonight for a lecture by Professor Cecilia Rouse. As you know, it's entitled Getting Kids Ready for School, the Economic Rationale for Closing Racial and Ethnic Gaps. Professor Rouse is in the economics department and in public affairs. That is the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. She also has a number of other titles which are not honorific but reflect her work. She is director of the Princeton University Education Research section. She is a research fellow in the Bentheim-Thoman Center for Research on Child Well-Being, which is in the Woodrow Wilson School. She is senior editor of The Future of Children, a publication that is a joint project of Princeton University and the Brookings Institution. She is editor of the Journal of Labor Economics, and her primary focus is labor economics, and with a specialty in economics of education. Now, she was had a year at the White House in the National Economic Council, and that was in 98, 99. And when she returned, this is the little bridge to Alan Kruger, she was the acting director of the Princeton Survey Research Center, which Alan Kruger founded, the first speaker in our series. I would like to just list for you some of the projects that she's engaged in. This is real-life work, research that has its application to the real world. She has studied the economic benefit of community college attendance. She's evaluated the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. She's looked at the effects of education inputs on student achievement. She's studied unions in South Africa. She is currently conducting randomized evaluations of technology-based programs in schools in Hartford, Connecticut, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She's working on an evaluation of strategies for increasing educational attainment among community college students. And she's also looking at the impact of student loans on post-college occupational choices. She had her start in college at Harvard, left after she graduated to go to Dakar, Senegal, and I noted that she did so on a Rotary Fellowship. Sometimes we wonder when we're a part of organizations that give fellowships what happened. Professor Rouse is an example of that. And then she went back to Harvard for her PhD, joined the Princeton faculty in the early 90s and was promoted to full professor in 2001. And as you no doubt can guess, has a long list of publications and other studies that she's conducted. And as I told you when I had the privilege of introducing Alan Kruger, the introducer gets to pick one thing that stands out. And so tonight, this is what I picked about Professor Rouse. She conducted a study called Orchestrating Impartiality, the Impact of Blind Auditions in Female Musicians. And she did that together with a distinguished woman economist from Princeton who is now, I guess, at Penn, Harvard, Claudia Golden. And so you can see she has wide-ranging interests and experience, and we're delighted that she's part of this series. Welcome, Professor Rouse.
Okay, so I want to have this close by.
Can't hear.
You can't hear me. Can you hear me now? Is this on?
Yeah.
Can you closer up?
Yes.
All right, technologically challenged. Is that better?
Yeah.
Right, sort of is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. As noted, I'm a senior editor at The Future of Children, and this is going to be a shameless plug for the journal this evening, so bear with me. So closing racial and ethnic gaps in school achievement has been a wide-ranging focus of educational policy for the past 30 years. And the reason is because there are large gaps in the educational achievement of students by grade 12. So what this chart shows you are results from the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is often called our nation's report card on education. What's nice about the NAEP is that it's a survey of nationally representative survey of students, and it's conducted periodically. And unlike other outcomes such as SAT scores, which are on a select population, this is really meant to be nationally representative. So it really gives us an idea, a gauge of how well students in the U.S. are performing on certain tasks and in certain subjects. So students on the NAEP are tested in reading and math and science. I think there's a writing component. This just shows you the gaps in reading, but these same gaps exist in other subjects. And so this is for 12th graders in 2002. And as you can see, 43% of the white students scored at or above the proficient level. What's the proficient level, you ask? That is meant to reflect that the students display solid academic performance. So 43% of white students display solid academic performance compared to only 16% of African American students and 22% of Hispanic students. You can see that's also compared to 34% of Asian students. So these racial and ethnic gaps in student achievement have been a source of concern for many years, and in fact, federal policy in education is focused on narrowing these gaps. That's what No Child Left Behind Act is focused on, and that is just the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which goes back to the 1960s, which has its intentional focus on closing the gaps. So this is a source of much concern, and much of the policy has been directed at our elementary and secondary education. So No Child Left Behind is focused on increasing accountability for elementary and secondary schools, but the fact is these racial and ethnic gaps exist well before students even get to school. Now, for the NAEP, the first time the students are tested is in 4th grade, and so that's the earliest I can go back. But you can see even as early as 4th grade that 37% of, and this is the 4th graders in 1994, which is when the 12th graders were in 4th grade. So it's not the same students exactly, but it's the same cohort of students. And you can see that then 37% of white students were achieving at or above proficient, compared to 9% of African American students and 13% of Hispanic students. Notice that actually the percent scoring at or above achievement has increased between 4th and 12th grade, but the gaps have not been narrowed. So these gaps that exist in 12th grade existed well before then. In fact, by one estimate, 50% of the gap at 12th grade can be explained by differences in school entry. I'm currently doing some work in Florida, so this is just hot off the press, and I shouldn't really be talking about it because it could change tomorrow. But we were looking at, we have data from one of the school districts in Florida, and we can follow cohorts of students all the way through, from 1st grade all the way through 10th, which is I think the last time they're tested. And we can see the gaps in 1st grade, and the gaps are exactly the same size in 10th grade. So if we really want to tackle the gaps when students are in high school and when they're graduating, we have to, I'm not saying we don't want to look at what schools are doing, but we also have to go back to what are the gaps at entry. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. So what do we mean by school readiness? Most educators would break school readiness into 2 components. First, there is the child's academic skills. This is the size of the child's vocabulary, whether the child can count, how good is his or her spoken language, basically his or her general knowledge. And tonight I'm going to mostly focus on what we know about academic skills, because that's what most of the research is focused on, and therefore it's what I can talk about. But most teachers will say that the most important thing is not at kindergarten. Remember, we're talking about kindergarten. The most important thing is not how well a child knows his or her alphabet, but whether a child is socially and emotionally ready for school. And by this we mean, do they have good impulse control? Are they able to sit still? Do they play well with others? Can they listen? And that these social, emotional skills are at least as important, if not most important, for school entry. Because if a child's not ready to learn socially and emotionally, he or she's not going to be able to absorb the academic curriculum either. So while tonight I'm going to focus on the academic side, I want us to keep in mind that the social and emotional components are just as, if not more important. This is largely an issue of data, but really the research is starting to recognize that this is very important, and I think we'll learn more about this as we go forward. So why is school readiness important? I just pitched to you, I think it's important for academic outcomes, but we also see other things as well. Students who are not ready for school perform less well in elementary, secondary school, but there are other outcomes for which they perform less well, and they're more likely to become teen parents, they're more likely to engage in criminal activities, they're more likely to suffer some form of depression. So school readiness really has big implications for how well students are going to do throughout their probably most of their lifetime. So it's for this reason that this is the inaugural issue for the Princeton Brookings version of The Future of Children. For many years, The Future of Children was a journal that was published by the Packard Foundation. We took it over almost 2 years ago. The issue on closing racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness is our first volume. I should make a plug for the current issue, which is you can get on the web at www.futureofchildren.org, which is on marriage. And we have an upcoming issue on childhood overweight and obesity as well, which will be out this year. So in this first issue, however, we wanted to go back and say, well, we know that these gaps exist in school readiness. When kids are entering school, what are the factors that we can learn about that affect school readiness? Because it's by understanding which factors contribute to the gap that we can start to develop policy to try to mitigate such things. So the volume really tries to break it down into the different components that we, the editors, and I did this with Sarah McClanahan, who's my colleague at Princeton, and Jeannie Brooks-Dunn, who's a developmental psychologist at Columbia University, and we broke it into the different components that we thought might be most important. I'll talk today about what I think are the highlights, but really the whole issue is, I think, in my opinion, just terrific. One thing I would like to note is this issue and my talk today will kind of focus on differences in school readiness between African Americans and whites, some less, a little bit less on Hispanics and whites, almost nothing on Asians and whites, and really nothing to say about Native Americans and whites, or Native Americans and Hispanics and other differences. And most of this is driven by data. So it's not to be an intentional omission, it's really just driven by the data that exists. And we chose to focus on differences not only because we thought that's a noble goal for policy, but because we also think that by highlighting policies that can close gaps will also just highlight things that are good policy. And as I just mentioned, we focus on certain groups not because we're trying to limit the scope of our paper, of this volume and my discussion, but really because of data limitations. Okay, so before I can talk about racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness, we need to have a little statistical primer. And I will apologize a little bit, but not too much. A big from economics and having taught statistics. So the first thing that I want to establish is how large is the gap. Now the fact is kids are tested and assessed on over 200 different scales. There are like over 200 scales of reading alone, and each of these scales has a different number that pops out on what a child knows or does not know. So one of the things we first have to establish is how can we make all of these different test gaps. So for example, if a child gets a score of 50 on an IQ test, how does that compare to a 75 on the latest test that was developed by the Department of Education with the help of ETS here in Princeton? You know, is that the same number or is it a different number? So the way that researchers tend to try to standardize these test scores is by comparing the score to the spread of the distribution. So for example, what we're interested in is if 50 on one test, is that a big number or a small number, and is a gap of say 10 a big number or small number, the way we're going to judge that is by looking at what's the spread of the test scores around the mean. So this figure is just kind of a representative distribution between blacks and whites. It's from the PPBT, which is a vocabulary test. But really, a lot of these look very similar using other tests as well. So on the PPBT, the mean score is about 50 in the population as a whole. On the graph that you're looking at in front of you, the median score for blacks was about 40, the median score for whites was 52. So that leaves a gap of 12 points. Now, is 12 a big or a small number? Well, if the spread of test scores based on this test is very wide, 12 may not be a very meaningful number. It may not be very large at all, because the spread is in general very large on this test. On the other hand, if the spread of scores on this test is very narrow, then 12 may be a relatively large number. So the way that we understand the test score gap is by taking the gap and dividing it by the standard deviation, which is our measure of the spread of the distribution. So for example, on the graph that I just showed you, the standard deviation and test scores in general in the population is 10, so 10 points is the standard deviation. And we just said that there was a gap of 12 points between black students and white students. So if we take those 12 points and divide it by the standard deviation, a measure of the spread, we get a gap of 1.2 standard deviation units, or the gap is 120% of the standard deviation. So that would suggest it's a relatively large gap based on the test scores using this test. Everybody on board? So, given that little primer, what are some of the estimates of the gap as they exist? So this is a table that shows just if you were to take a group of black students and a group of white students, what would be the difference in their scores? And this shows the estimates from a variety of different sources. So the first two estimates are based on this new data set called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey of kindergartners. So it started with a group of kindergartners, and it's following them every year. They have them through third grade. I think they intend to go through fifth grade. And with this new test score that was developed by ETS. And based on that data set, we would estimate that the gap in test scores between white students and black students in math is about 61% of a standard deviation. Okay, big, small, I'm not sure. And we can see that the gap is pretty similar between blacks and whites and between Hispanic and whites as well. And that the gap in reading is about 0.4 of a standard deviation, so about 40% of the standard deviation. Again, is this big or small? I'm not entirely sure, but when I compare it to what people have gotten from other tests, such as the PPVT, which is a vocabulary test, or the WIPSI, which is an IQ test, those gaps of 60% and 40% are looking kind of small. So based on other estimates in the literature, which are more in the range of 120% of a standard deviation, we see the big one here is 170%, 171% of a standard deviation. The most recent estimates look relatively small, but in general, all of these are fairly large. Looking at all these together, you might say, well, what might explain such variation in all of these test scores? There's a paper in the volume by Donald Rock, who developed the ECLSK test score. He's an ETS. And Jackson Stenner, who is a reading specialist. He's a psychologist as well. And they go through a variety of explanations that might explain why there's such a variety of estimates of what the test score gap looks like. And they conclude that is not likely due to different characteristics of students. One thing you might be concerned about is, well, for example, if one study has a lot of bilingual students and another study does not have a lot of bilingual students, well, maybe the study that has a lot of English language learners is going to get a bigger estimate of the gap than a study that does not have them. Or if you've got a study that's got a lot of students who need special education, whereas another study excluded them, that might also affect the gap. They conclude that this may explain differences around the edges, but it's not going to explain a difference of 171% of a standard deviation versus 60% of standard deviation. Another potential explanation is, well, maybe there's racial and ethnic bias in the test. This has been alleged for many years, and it's certainly a concern for developers of tests. They also conclude that this is unlikely. Perhaps it's not surprising that someone from ETS who developed his own test would think that it's not a problem. But he has a couple of compelling reasons why it may not be a big problem. One is so one concern might be that African American kids and Hispanic kids might know different things than white kids. And so one thing that they've looked at is they've looked at African American and minority kids and white kids who get the same score on a test. And then what they do is they look at, well, what was the pattern of right answers and wrong answers? And what they found is that those patterns of right and wrong are really similar. So it doesn't look like the African American kids know some things and the white kids know other things. If the scores are the same, it looks like they pretty much knew the same things. So they call that differential, they call that construct bias, and they conclude, or differential item functioning. They conclude that that's not a problem. The other issue is construct bias, which is the test reflecting what you want it to reflect? So how well is the test testing what you think it's testing? And after many years of being concerned about this is where, sort of the classic example in the SAT is there's some analogy involving, rowing is to something, and if you've never seen an oar or a cruise, if you've never seen a shell. I'm from California, we didn't have a lot of cruise boats in my high school. Now you might be worried that, some kids are exposed to some issues and not others, or have some experiences. And after many years of being worried about this on these tests, again, this may be something that affects different test scores around the edges, but it's probably not a big explanation. And the other piece of evidence that they suggest, which I think suggests that racial and ethnic bias is not a big problem, is that these tests at kindergarten do just as well predicting how well kids are going to do later for blacks as for whites. In fact, they tend to over-predict how well blacks and Hispanics are going to do relative to whites. Whereas if you think there was bias, at least at school entry, what you would expect is it would under-predict. Because if the test, you could say, well, the test applies later on too, which aren't against that. But you would think that if the tests, especially at school entry, were really flawed against one group versus another, then they shouldn't predict later performance nearly as well. And they tend to predict later performance equally well. So the authors conclude, and that's conclude loosely, but they suspect that the explanation lies in the fact that these tests are testing different constructs. So the ECLS-K tended to focus on memory, rote things, such as the alphabet, counting, whereas these other vocabulary tests were testing higher order functioning. And so it may be that the racial method gaps on these sort of rote skills is a lot smaller than it is when you get to higher order skills. And in fact, by the time they get to third grade, the racial and ethnic gaps, even in the ECLS-K, are much larger, and they start to approach those in these other tests. Another more promising explanation, however, is that the ECLS-K is the latest and greatest, and it could be that there's just been closing of racial and ethnic gaps over time. We can't tell that just having this one study, but maybe when the next study comes along, we can see whether it seems to line up with the ECLS-K. The bottom line is, however, we don't really know. So since we don't really know, what we did is we took away from it, we sort of concluded that the racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness are about 1 standard deviation. So that's the number that we tended to keep in mind, we being the editors of the volume, took away from this study. And so that leaves us with the question, well, how large is 1 standard deviation in terms of a gap in test scores? So here are 3 examples that are in this paper. One is that if there is a 1 standard deviation in the white minority gap in test scores, then 84% of the white children will perform better than the average minority child, while only 16% of minority children will perform better than the average white child. As another example, if a school chooses only the top scoring 5% of students for gifted classes, there will be 13 times more whites than minorities in such classes, just statistically. And the last example is, if a reading textbook is written so that the average white student understands 75% of it, the average minority student will only understand 53% of it, which will virtually guarantee that that reader will not engage with the text, and therefore have a very difficult time with your test, with comprehension. So these test score gaps are large and they're meaningful, and they're important. All right, so what might explain it? So a first place to look is obviously the socioeconomic status of the families of these kids. So by this we mean the income of the parents, the educational attainment of the parents, the environment that the child is growing up in. And so to understand the role of socioeconomic status, here's just a very compelling example of why it probably does make a big difference. The first 2 sets of bars show for blacks, this is the gap between blacks and whites and Hispanics and whites in the ECLS math in our newly learned standard deviation units. And then the next one is the gaps in the reading test scores. So these numbers are similar to the numbers I showed you before, not exactly the same, different authors, but pretty much the same. And then when you look at the gaps in socioeconomic status, this is an index which is a function of the parent's education, the parent's income, and the parent's occupation. You see that the racialized gaps in socioeconomic status are as large as, if not larger than, the gaps in test scores. So socioeconomic status is likely a big player in this game. And so one thing that people have done is to say, well, how much does it account for the gaps in school readiness? So the first column, so the first and third column, show you the gaps that I showed you before. In the second column, where it says ADJ for adjusted, and the fourth column, I show you the estimates where they've controlled for the socioeconomic status of the family. So in this case, what they're saying is if we look at a Hispanic child and a white child that come from a family with the same sort of socioeconomic status background, what is the gap in test scores between those 2 children? Not just taking a random Hispanic child and a random white child. When we control for the socioeconomic status of the family, you see the test score gaps drop by a lot. And in fact, one of the funny rules that exist across these columns is that when you control for socioeconomic status of the family, the test score gap drops by about 1/2 of a standard deviation. Now, 1/2 of a standard deviation means a lot less if you start with a standard deviation of 1.7 than if you start with one of 0.6, but it still explains a significant chunk of the initial gaps. And in fact, with the ECLS-K, there's a paper by Steve Levin, who wrote Freakonomics, just for those of you who have undoubtedly read it, and Roland Fryer, and that's where these data shown, where basically they say, once you have controlled for a few measures of the family socioeconomic status, you've basically explained the racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness. In their study, which uses the ECLSK, it drops by 7. Socioeconomic status explains 70 to 80% of the gap, which is rather impressive. All right, well, you can say, well, that's nice, but what does it mean? And that's what I've always wondered. Okay, so if we compare a black child and a white child that come from the same family income, are we talking about just if I give the black family more money, that's going to suddenly magically make the test score gap disappear, or what are we really talking about? And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about now. In the volume, we take on the leading contenders. So as uncomfortable as it might be, one of the factors that we asked is whether genetics plays a role. One of the things that might explain the role of socioeconomic status is not the income per se, but might be the fact that families that are doing well have better genes, so they're more able. The parents are more able, they have more able children, those children perform better on tests. So this has nothing to do with the socioeconomic status of the family per se, but with the genetic endowment that's coming between the families that have higher income today and what their children will do tomorrow. One of the papers in our volume by William Dickens, who's at the Brookings Institution, looks at this issue. And what he explains in his paper is that while genetics is certainly important for explaining how people do within racial and ethnic groups, so genetics certainly plays an important function in explaining differences within the African American community or within the white community. But from what we know, genetics does not explain much across communities, because basically the genetic variation within communities swamps the genetic variation across communities. So the genetics is not going to get us very far in explaining racial and ethnic gaps across communities, although it certainly has a role to play in how kids do overall. So, and he has some nice evidence on this front, such as studies in using German soldiers who fathered children in Germany and adoption studies. So there's more than just speculation here. There's actually some empirical evidence on this. But it really looks like genetics is not a big factor. So what might explain it? So we thought, and we said, well, again, we don't think it's just that if we gave parents $1,000, try to do more than that. If we gave parents $50,000 and said, just put this in your mattress, put it in your savings account, and save it for a rainy day, and that money is magically going to have an effect on their children, we don't likely think that that's really what's going on. But rather that when you give a parent $50,000, it's what they do with that money that counts. So for example, do they use it to purchase better child care or better learning materials in their home? Or do they use it to alleviate some of the stresses in the home because now they don't worry so much about being thrown out of their house or being able to put food on the table? So they're having less stress in the household. Perhaps the mothers and fathers are less prone to depression. And these things may operate through, for example, parenting, and it's really therefore the improvement in parenting that's going to make the children do better. Or is it that they're able to purchase better health care? Or, so in other words, is it what they do with the money that really matters, or is it just giving them the money? Well, obviously we're all going to stand here and say, well, it's what they do with the money that matters. And this is important for policy because one of the things that's been shown time and again is that it's really hard to change the socioeconomic status of families. There have been many attempts to do so. Programs to improve the educational attainment of single mothers, programs to improve the educational attainment of anybody. The best we've been able to do so far is improve that by about 1 year, which in the end doesn't translate into a big improvement in income, even though I study education, so I think that's important. But it certainly isn't going to make a huge difference in the lives of the kids. On the other hand, what it may suggest is that we want to focus more on the behaviors. And I think there's more optimism to believe that by focusing on different behaviors that might affect how children do, that will have a bigger effect on school readiness. That's what I want to talk a little bit about, is some of the important factors. And as I discuss this evidence, I want to remind you of a couple of things. One is that I'm focusing on racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness. So for a behavior to affect these gaps, two things must hold. First, there has to be a racial and ethnic gap in the behavior or input. So first I'll be establishing, is there a racial ethnic gap in this behavior? And second, the behavior has to matter for school readiness itself. Because if there are racial ethnic gaps in the behavior, but the behavior doesn't matter for school readiness, it's not really going to affect school readiness. Similarly, if there's no racial ethnic gap in the behavior, even if the behavior is important for school readiness, it's not going to affect the racial gaps either. So I'll talk about the evidence in those two parts. Okay, so first I want to talk about low birth weight and health. So one of the factors which many people have turned to is what is the role of child health, and child health can go back prenatally in their readiness for school 5 years later. And so we looked at this in two ways. One is looking at low birth weight, and which is many people believe is a measure of prenatal care and the health of the infant at birth. And the second is health at older ages. Now, why is it that people focus on birth weight as a measure of the child's health at birth? Well, one is it's measured very well, and is readily accessible for large samples of individuals. That's the good news. The bad news is no one really knows what it means. So we know that for very low birth weight, those are children who are born at less than 1,500 grams, and so that's less than 3.3 pounds. So those are little teeny guys. We know very low birth weight kids can have serious health problems, and those serious health problems can persist into childhood and beyond. Low birth weight are children born at less than 2,500 grams. Those kids are doing a little better, but they're still associated with health outcomes. Beyond that, I have to say, as far as I can tell, I'm not a health economist, but as far as I've looked at the literature, we don't really have a good understanding of what the role of birth weight is. But we do know that very low birth weight and low birth weight may matter. And as you can see in this chart, there are racial and ethnic gaps, at least there are racial gaps in low birth weight. So about 3% of African American babies are born very low birth weight compared to only 1% of white babies and 1% of Hispanic babies. And about 13% of African American babies are born low birth weight compared to about 7% of white babies and Hispanic babies. I should note that the fact that Hispanic babies look like, at least in terms of birth weight, they look very similar to white babies has been termed the Hispanic paradox. So Hispanic families have lower socioeconomic status, and yet the health of the children looks pretty good. And they haven't really understood what about being Hispanic is so protective, and it's one of those pluses in health. So we know that being low birth weight potentially has some adverse effects on later outcomes, such as it's been documented to be children who are born very low birth weight and low birth weight are more likely to be placed in special education. And there are some suggest that they have a lot of variety of other learning challenges, such as they're more likely to have attention deficit disorder, etc., which undoubtedly affects their school performance. So birth weight looks like it might be a factor. That said, this racial gap in birth weight has existed for many, 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 many years. And it has not really closed much over the past, since people have been measuring birth weight. And this is also a bit of a question. There's the Hispanic paradox, but it's also not so clear why African American babies are more likely to be born light. African American babies, conditional on their birth weight, also do better than white babies. So one of the questions are the norms different for African American babies versus white babies, so that this is sort of misleading. But that's one of those open questions. What about older children? So African American children have other health problems as well. So, for example, one common health outcome for children is asthma. And as you can see, about 18% of African American children aged 0 to 17 have been diagnosed with asthma, compared to only about 10 or 11% of whites and Hispanics. And if you look at whether the child has actually suffered an asthma attack, which suggests whether the asthma is under control or not, African American children are more likely to have asthma that's not under control, by reflecting the fact that they've recently had an asthma attack as well. So when we look at asthma, again, we see racial gaps in the health of the children. And why would asthma affect school readiness and school performance? Well, children who suffer asthma are more likely to miss school. And there is one study that suggests that children with asthma are more likely to be diagnosed with learning disabilities and or to repeat a grade as well. So asthma is one example. We also think that part of the reason for the increased prevalence of asthma among African American children has to do with their environment. Another example of an environmental problem that would lead to health differences is lead. Lead has been well documented to affect cognitive functioning in children, and we also know that exposure to lead through old paint and lead pipes in old buildings leads to higher rates of lead toxicity among African American children as well. And here we also see a difference with Hispanic children, but you can see that 9% of African American children aged 0 to 5 have elevated blood levels, elevated lead levels in their blood, compared to 2% of white children, and then we have 6% of Hispanic children as well. So where does this all lead? Well, we're interested in what's the effect of this on school readiness. And so how large might be the contribution of these health effects to school readiness? So when we put it together, we see here's the potential health difference. Are there racial and ethnic differences? Yes, particularly with respect to African Americans and whites and Hispanics. Are there effects on school readiness? Yes, in terms of the different health outcomes I've looked at here. And how much do they contribute to the gap? Well, low birth weight contributes at most 2 to 4%. May explain about 2 to 4% of the racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness. Asthma, especially on behavioral scales, only about 2 to 3%. ADHD, which I didn't talk about explicitly, but there are increased rates for African Americans and Hispanics as well, probably only about 1 to 2% of differences in school readiness. So you can see, while each of these, so we've established that there are racial and ethnic gaps in these different health conditions. It's not so clear that individually they contribute much to the racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness. Now, why is that? It's because kids are pretty healthy overall. And so the prevalence of any one of these health differences is really very small. So it's not going to be able to explain a big gap in school readiness when it only affects a small portion of the population. That said, if we were to add all of them together, Janet Curry, who authored this paper, nonetheless suspects that school health problems may account to about 12 to 13% of the racial and ethnic gap in school readiness. This may be an overestimate because kids who are sick along one dimension are often sick along another, and so we may be double counting. It also might be an underestimate in that we haven't spanned all of, and she did not research all of the different health outcomes that may differ between kids of different races, and also the fact that there are statistical reasons why it's very hard to study these issues in different populations. So it could be an underestimate, it could be an overestimate. 13% looks like, middle of the road. Who knows? She also points out that if you add in maternal behavior, so for example, prevalence of breastfeeding, which many believe is an important contributor to health of the child, and maternal depression, which turns out to be a very important component to how kids do in school, we actually may explain more like a quarter of the 20 to 25% of racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness when you look at children's health, maternal health, and behaviors as well combined. Okay, so that's what the potential role of health is. What about parenting? So this one is a touchy issue to talk about, especially in the context of racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness, because what makes a good parent in one population may not be what makes a good parent in another. That said, it's never going to stop a developmental psychologist from trying. I believe that Jeannie Brooks-Gunn and Lisa Markman, who wrote this paper, actually have a very sensitive discussion about these potential cultural differences. And I urge you to look at their paper if you have concerns. So they note that while there are cultural differences, across all cultures, parenting can, this is sort of the academic version, parenting can be boiled down to these set of issues. So even though you've got differences in literally how these express in almost all cultures, parents have a way of expressing love and affection and care, which they consider nurturance. Parents have a way of disciplining their child. That may differ from one culture, one subpopulation to another, or across one country to another, but all parents attempt to discipline their children in some way. All parents attempt to teach their children. All parents attempt to transmit language to their children. They have to monitor their children. They also have to manage their child's day, since their children are not capable of doing that themselves. And in all cultures, parents are providing materials that can help their child learn or not learn, to play with, etc. And so even though there may be cultural differences, across all cultures, we can talk about these dimensions of parenting, which seem to be important for child outcomes. Does parenting matter? This is a very hard question to answer. We think that the best way to address whether these different behaviors or inputs matter for child outcomes is by conducting randomized experiments. So in this randomized experiment, you would randomly assign some parents to nurture their child and randomly assign another set of parents not to nurture their child. That's not going to go over very well. And so it's really impossible to conduct this kind of randomized evaluation, presumably to look at adoption studies. And so you can't, not only is it difficult to conduct the randomized evaluation, but to distinguish parenting from all the other stuff, genetics, socioeconomic status, etc., is just going to be impossible, especially without that randomized evaluation. So what psychologists do instead is they look at interventions which have a parenting component and look to see if the interventions, which presumably affected the parenting component, seem to affect child outcomes. So it's a little more indirect than on other inputs. And so one particularly nice piece of evidence on this comes from an evaluation of early Head Start. So Head Start starts at age 3. Early Head Start is a program which goes from age 0 to 3. And it includes much more parenting, because what do you do with a 6-month-old? But it's essentially about parenting, except for the flashcards. It's not very clever. But it's essentially about parenting. So they look at early Head Start. And so there was a randomized evaluation of early Head Start that included a parenting component. So one of the things that they found is that reading to their children is one of the big parenting components that all of these studies look at. So one of the results of the study was that the more that the parents read to the children at 1 year of age, the higher the child's vocabulary at 2. And the more vocabulary the child had at 2, the more reading the child was doing at 2 and 3 years of reading. And so therefore there was this kind of snowball effect where if you intervened with the parent and changed their behavior with regard to reading, you could see effects at older ages with the children in terms of the outcome. And so this isn't the only evidence that parenting matters, but is among the most recent, and it's quite compelling since it's based on a randomized evaluation of the intervention. So are there racial and ethnic gaps in parenting, and does it affect school readiness? So based on watching parents interact with their children, and there has been learning in the field on this in terms of, apparently African American parents sometimes know what they are categorized as having what they call tough love, which was not a behavior which was recognized earlier. So actually it was Jeannie Brooks Gunn's students who were saying, we have these categorization, and that's not really capturing what's going on in African American communities. So there really are attempts to make these judgments on what's happening between the parent and the child culturally sensitive. Nonetheless, it has been documented that white parents are known to exhibit more teaching with their children. There's more language interchange with the children. Based on socioeconomic status, they provide more stimulating materials in the home, and they have less harsh discipline than African American parents, even with the qualification of a lot of African American parents look like they're being tough, but it's a consistent kind of tough, so actually it's not so bad for the children. So it does look like there are racial and ethnic gaps in parenting, and a variety of evidence suggests that parenting matters for school readiness. So if you put the two together, some of the studies have suggested that racial and ethnic gaps can explain, this is a technical term, a good chunk of racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness, maybe 25 to 50%. So I think it's potentially quite important. The last input that I want to talk about is preschool enrollment. This is actually where I want to spend the rest of the talk, is talking about preschool programs. And I want to start by talking about trends in preschool enrollment over time. So one of the things you may not know is that if you look at 3-year-olds, the top blue line, so the darker blue line, is enrollment for African American children, and the orange line are white children. And so you can see that currently African American children are more likely to be enrolled in preschool at age 3 than are white children. So almost half of African American children are in preschool compared to about 43% of white children. Lagging well behind that are Hispanic children, where as of the latest data of this data, around 2000, only about 23% of Hispanic children were enrolled. Hispanic 3-year-olds were enrolled in preschool. So you may not realize, though, that when it comes to preschool, African American children are the most likely to be enrolled at age 3. By the time we get to age 4, more children are enrolled in preschool in general, and so the gaps are less. However, you can still see that African American children are the most likely to be enrolled in preschool, even at age 4. And this is going to be important because it's going to, the implication is going to be that increasing enrollment may not always have the effects that we think it's going to have for closing racial and ethnic gaps. So Catherine Magnuson and Jane Walfo will do some simulations where they consider, well, what do we know about the effect of preschool on student achievement, and what do we know about enrollment? And let's try to simulate what some policies might be to, simulate some policies such as increasing enrollment or increasing the quality of preschool, and what effect might that have on racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness. This first simulation is simply increasing enrollment to narrow gaps. So the first policy might be increasing Hispanic and Black enrollment to 80%. And you can see that if the gap were 1 standard deviation, then that would close between 2 and 10% of the white-black gap in school readiness. And that would close between 6 and 26% of his Hispanic-white gap in school readiness. That's going to have a bigger effect for Hispanics and whites because Hispanics are less likely to be enrolled in preschool to begin with. If we were to make preschool available for all children who are at or below the poverty line, that again is going to have smaller effects because fewer children are below the poverty line than at 80%. If we go to the fourth policy, many states are implementing universal preschool programs. If we were to make preschool available for all children, that would actually potentially serve to widen racial and ethnic gaps in school readiness for between African Americans and whites. But it would do our job. It would close between 3 and 12% of the gap for Hispanics. Again, the reason why it might widen the gap between African Americans and whites is because African Americans are already enrolled in preschool. So making it available for everybody is not going to help them keep ahead. It's going to let the others get further ahead. So just increase, if we're focused on rate, this is where you might want to not just focus on gaps, but if we're focused on narrowing gaps, just increasing enrollment is not likely to do it. So then they said, well, what if we were to improve quality by, and what they considered were 10% of a standard deviation increase in quality, 20%, 30% of an increase in standard deviation in quality. And they said, what effect might that have? So suppose we were to improve Head Start, which is our biggest program for serving low-income students in preschool. That would close, again, if the gap were 1 standard deviation, that would close between 2 and 5% of the gap between whites and blacks, and about 2 and 4% of the gap between Hispanics and whites. Again, improving quality alone is not going to make a big difference because it depends on what we're talking about. So Head Start, relative to the rest of the world in pre-K, looks pretty good. Although I'm going to try to convince you that relative to what we could be doing, it's not so good. But if we look at what Head Start does compared to what most people are getting today, and if we were to simply improve Head Start by a little bit of relative to those programs, it's not going to make a huge difference. But it will make some headway. What if we were to put the two together? Well, then obviously we're going to start seeing some more interesting numbers. If we were to enroll all children who are at or below the poverty line and improve quality, we would close the black-white gap in school readiness by 5 to 10%, and the white-Hispanic gap would close by between 5 and 9%. You notice again, if we were to enroll all children and improve quality, we're going to widen gaps again between the African Americans and white. Again, this is because the African American students are already enrolled in Head Start, which in this field is among the better preschool programs available. So this is just a reminder that if we're going to charge ahead, we want to charge ahead sensibly. So if we put all of this together, what do we think are some promising strategies for closing racial and ethnic gaps? Well, one is addressing the health issues, and that's not going to be simply making more children eligible for state aid or state health insurance, such as through Medicaid and state child health insurance programs, because most poor children are already eligible, but they're not enrolled. So what we need to do is somehow find a way to get them to increase enrollment, not necessarily eligibility. I didn't really talk about this, but there are some advances that are happening in neuroscience, which are still early, but which may be promising in years to come, which would allow us to develop very effectively targeted programs to help specific children. And what I want to talk about for the rest of my time, however long that might be, before I need to open these up for questions, is what might be the potential by increasing access to high-quality center-based early education programs. And by this, I don't just mean Head Start, but I mean really what we call the model preschool programs, which I'm going to show you have been shown to be very effective. And if we were to develop programs that look like them, I think we might make some headway. So what do these programs look like? Well, they're of high quality, so that means that they have small classes and high teacher-pupil ratios, and that the teachers are very well trained and well educated. The teachers need to be trained to identify behavioral problems with children and to work with the children and their parents to develop their behavioral and social skills. These programs should have a parenting component so that the parents can mimic at home what the teachers are doing at school. The staff need to be trained to recognize and help monitor and help the parents coordinate health care for children that have health care problems. And lastly, a lot of times what happens is that kids are in pretty good preschool programs and then they go off to a kindergarten program that bears no resemblance to what they just had in preschool. And that really these preschool programs need to be much better integrated with the elementary schools to which the children will be belong. So what are some programs which we might turn to get some inspiration? Well, there have been 3 that have been conducted and which are known in the area as the model programs, and which have been rigorously evaluated, so actually know something about their effects. The 3 programs are known as the Perry Preschool Project, Abecedarian, and Chicago CPC, which is Chicago Parent-Child Centers. They were all, notice the year it began, were all in the 60s and 70s. So the bad news is these are kind of dated in terms of when the programs were started. The good news is it means we can look at fairly long follow-ups, and so we can look at the effects not only when the children are in preschool or elementary school, but we can look at follow-ups well into their adult years as well. All of these programs involve low-income families that had high proportions of minority children. They all started to work with the children in preschool. Perry started at age 3, as did Chicago CPC. Chicago CPC was preschool, and then it also had a component that went into the elementary schools as well. Abecedarian was the most intense of the 3, and it started at birth. The children were selected at birth, and so it was an intervention that, you know, heavily involved the parents, and they had the parents working with the children early on. They all had a parent component. Perry, once a week, teachers would visit the homes of the parents. Abecedarian as well had a parental education program and also a home visit. CPC did as well. Chicago CPC did as well. All of them had highly qualified teachers. You can see it's not literally specified for Abecedarian and Chicago CPC, but I think what the understanding is that those teachers were better qualified. As a comparison, for example, Perry, all of the teachers had master's degrees and were state certified in elementary and secondary education. By comparison, in Head Start, only about 30% of the teachers had bachelor's degrees and are not necessarily have specialties in early childhood education. Another biggie, the compensation. In all these programs, the teachers were paid what the average teachers are paid in the public school system. On average, public school teachers are paid something like $22,000 to $20,000 a year. Preschool teachers are paid 1/2 that. So one of the things that's good that comes out of this literature is that we have to stop treating the preschool teachers as if they're just glorified babysitters, and that they need to be professionals just like our elementary and secondary school teachers. They have relatively small class sizes. Notice the last line, however. So Perry costs in 2004 about $17,000 per child per year. Abecedarian rolled in at about $44,000 per child per year. And the Chicago CPC was about almost $8,000 per year for the preschool component, about $12,000 a year total. So these are not cheap interventions. By comparison, Head Start is about $7,000 per child per year. One of the things I hope you take away from this is, however, you get what you pay for. So what were the effects of these programs? So one of the things that many people are well aware of about these preschool programs is they have what are known as fade-out problems. So for example, let's look at Perry. So when the kids were entered into Perry, Perry was evaluated with random assignment. And so in Perry, when the kids entered, the IQ scores were about the same between the kids that got the treatment and the kids that did not, which is good news. That means that, okay, the random assignment looks pretty good, the two groups look pretty comparable. By age 4, there was a pretty big gap that had opened up between the two in terms of IQ scores. That gap persisted at age 5. By age 6, we're starting to get a little worried. And by age 7, 8, 9, 10, there's no difference again. So while it looks like Perry had a short-term effect on IQ scores, it looks like it faded out by the time the kids got into elementary school. And so many people have taken from this to suggest that preschool has a short-term effect, but it doesn't have longer-run effects on students. What might explain this fade-out? Well, people have turned to, well, you have these kids in these really good preschool programs, and then you just leave them to go to their regular crummy elementary school, where the teachers are not continuing and building on the base that the kids got in preschool. Another potential problem is that in some of these studies, this is going to be study specific, special education students and those who are held back a grade were not tested. And so if part of the effect of the preschool program was to keep kids out of special ed, to keep kids from not being held back a grade, you're going to have a more representative population being tested among the kids who got the preschool than among the kids who did not. So the kids who did not look a little better than they really were on average. So that's a statistical problem. And 2, and the last thing is 3, I guess, is that it may be that if you intervene at age 3, you're able to change some aspects of achievement, but not all. Whereas if you were to intervene earlier, you can actually start to affect the wiring up, and that may have a more profound effect on something like IQ than you get if you just start to intervene at age 3. And one thing that might support that is looking at abecedarian. Remember, abecedarian started at birth and was much more intensive. It was full day, full time for 5 years. And there, this is IQ scores over time in abecedarian, and we don't see the fade out. We see even by age 21, you can't see that there, but that says by age 21, I can see it on my screen. By age 21, there's still a significant improvement in the IQ scores of the kids who are in the abecedarian program. The other thing that tends to be true with these programs is that even if there aren't effects on IQ, there were effects on other forms of achievement tests. So, for example, in the abecedarian, where there was not a fade out, but nonetheless we can look at their reading achievement scores, there were reading achievement scores at age 8 that continued to age 21. And if we look at their math scores, you can see the math scores of the kids the orange is the kids who were in abecedarian, were decreasing over time, but nonetheless they still were keeping ahead of the kids who were in the control group. So there were achievement differences that persisted all the way through age 21 in abecedarian. If we look at the Chicago CPC, we get the same effect. It may not look like these differences are very meaningful, but they actually are. They're like 0.6 of a standard deviation. So the kids who are in the Chicago CPC, the orange line shows their test scores at age 5 and age 6, and then again at age 9 and age 14, and they're statistically better than the test scores of the kids who are in the comparison schools. So even though we may see a fade out in terms of IQ scores, there are improvements in other outcomes. Another outcome that many people worry about, especially school superintendents, is what's the effect on being placed in special education or being held back a grade. And all of these programs have had big effects there too. So for Perry, they only give us these 2 results combined. But you can see the kids who were in the program group, which is orange, 17% were ever either placed in special ed or repeated a grade by grade 4, compared to 38% of the kids in the control group. In abecedarian, by age 15, 30% of the kids in abecedarian had repeated a grade compared to over half of the kids in the control group. Same with Chicago CPC, grade repetition was much lower among those who were in the treatment group. And similarly, the kids who received these high-quality preschool programs were less likely to be placed in special ed as well. Now, for those of you who follow education, know that special ed is hugely important, and repeating a grade means we're paying for the same thing twice. So we can immediately see that there would be some education savings from just these outcomes alone. So for example, with Perry, it's been calculated that just through the special ed and grade retention outcome, that through grade 12, that there was a savings of almost $9,500, which is almost half of the cost of Perry. So we've already got back about half of our cost there. If we look at Chicago CPC, we see a savings about $5,000, which was a good chunk, which is a lot of the preschool component, which I think was about $7,000, and almost half of the full cost. You can see in Abecedarian, we got a cost of almost $5,000. Okay, we're chipping away at the Abecedarian price tag. It'll take us longer to figure that out. Nonetheless, if you're a school superintendent already, you can see that this is going to generate some savings by having quality preschool. But yet, there's more. This is favorite Jensen and I. There are also outcomes in other domains. So Perry has been evaluated through age 27, and actually last summer they released results through age 40. And I'm going to tell you that all of these results exist through age 40. You can see that among the kids who are in the Perry preschool program, 29% earned at least $2,000 a month, compared to only 7% of the control. They were more likely to own their home. They were less likely to have ever been on welfare. You can see this is a big one in terms of the social cost. The kids who are in the comparison group by age 27 had been arrested on average 2.3 times, compared to 4.6 arrests for those in the control group. But again, that's going to be a big social savings because it's not cheap when people start to interact in our criminal justice system. You can see that those differences exist across all the different types of crimes. They look at felony crimes, misdemeanors, and juvenile crimes. So those who had been in the preschool program were less likely to engage, at least been arrested for criminal activity. For Abecedarian, we have the same kinds of outcomes. They're more likely to have a good job by age 21. They're more likely to, they're less likely to use social support services, or they're more likely to be self-supporting. They're less likely to have smoked by age 21, which again is a potential health outcome that socially we'd be paying for. For Chicago CPC, we see the same things. We see better outcomes for those students who were involved in the preschool program than for those who were not. So what does this mean in terms of cost-benefit ratio? So I'm going to start at the bottom. So if we calculate sort of adding up the monetary benefits, for example, of the criminal differences in criminal outcomes, et cetera, and this is what a few people have done. Perry Preschool seems to pay $7 on the dollar. So for every dollar that we put into Perry, we get $7 back in terms of a private return to the individual or a social return to society. So the crime is the big payoff here in terms of society, but so is welfare use and other outcomes as well. Abecedarian, the return is not as big because Abecedarian was so expensive to begin with, but nonetheless, for every dollar we put into Abecedarian, we get back $2 as a society. For Chicago CPC, we also get back about $7. Now, what about Head Start? So this Head Start is not entirely fair. It looks like we're only getting back 60 cents on the dollar. That's a little bit of a losing proposition. But the Head Start cost benefit only includes the outcomes through elementary school. So that includes grade retention and special education. Janet Curry has estimated that if the adult outcomes on Head Start, or even just a quarter of those in Perry, Head Start would pay for itself as well. And we might want to compare that to some interventions we might consider later. So we put on the board, for example, a program which is based on some neurological science known as Fast Forward. It's a language program which is meant to improve the reading ability of students who have cognitive processing problems. It's a program that was developed by neuroscientists and which many school districts have been adopting across the country because in 6 short weeks it looks like you can have huge improvements in the reading achievement of your students. Alan Kruger and I evaluated this experimentally in Hartford, Connecticut, and we didn't actually find that it made that there were any gains among those students in Fast Forward relative to those who were not. But if we just, a lot of that was because the gains were so small in our study, we couldn't really detect them statistically. But stipulate to a small gain of Fast Forward, then it would look, relative to what it would cost for a superintendent to put in place this, they have to buy a few computers and have some kids do this for 6 weeks, it looks like the principals might get, superintendents would give back $4.50 on the dollar. So that looks like it might be worthwhile. Tennessee STAR is a class size reduction. Ask any teacher what's the first thing we should do to improve school quality, they're going to say reduce class sizes. And the Tennessee STAR experiment was a randomized evaluation where something like 70 schools in Tennessee participated and students were randomly assigned to small classes, regular sized classes, or regular sized classes with a teacher's aide, and there were relatively large educational effects of being assigned to a small class. And even though Tennessee Star was an expensive experiment, because reducing class sizes is not cheap, nonetheless it would return about almost $3 on the dollar. And the last thing I put up was Job Corps, which is an intervention for older teens who have dropped out of school, and it's a job training program which involves a residential component. It costs about $15,000 to $20,000 per participant. So it's our Cadillac of job training programs. And the full evaluation suggests that it would pay about $2.60 on the dollar. If you kept it within sample, it might not pay for itself, although it's not really fair for me to put that up there. So what I want to show with this figure is that the good preschool programs look like they pay for themselves. And it looks like, though, there are some other interventions that we could potentially do instead that would allow students to catch up. But as I mentioned, you get what you pay for. So the preschool programs are among the most expensive, and what I want to argue is that if we really want to change the lives of these students, we can't be doing the little teeny programs around the edges, even if they look like they have positive cost-benefit ratios. So for example, if we look at Perry pays off, we showed it was about $7 to 1. And that's because the gains are, the gains in terms of the monetary gains in terms of society and the individual are like $42,000 per participant. So they're, by putting a student in Perry, it costs us about $17,000, but what we get back in terms of savings, social savings, and gains to the individual is more like $42,000. So that's a big change. Compare that to fast forward. So the superintendent puts it $820. And the gain that we're getting in terms of changing a child's life is about, $3,700. It's not very big because you don't put in much, you don't get out much. So the thing that I think is just impressive about the preschool programs is you put in a lot, you get back a lot. The same is true of the class size reduction, but that's pretty expensive too. The Tennessee class size reduction was about $9,000 per child per year, but we got back about $26,000. That's a meaningful difference. Job Corps is about $18,000 per year. Get back about $36,000, $35,000. So in sum, and this is a quote from Steve Barnett, who directs a Center on Early Childhood Education at Rutgers University. It just seems that the effects that we are observing in these preschool programs are large enough and persistent enough that they really seem to make a meaningful difference in the lives of the participants. The Perry preschool results at age 40 suggest, in terms of a cost-benefit ratio, for each dollar we put in, we're getting $17 back by age 40. So if we really want to make a big difference and have some meaningful change, we can't go cheap. You get what you pay for. And at preschool, if you look at the range of social interventions, particularly when it comes to education, is the one area where we see consistent evidence, at least in terms of the high-quality programs, that there are results. So we know that these high-quality programs exist, and that they could make headway in improving achievement for all students and also potentially for narrowing racial and ethnic gaps in school achievement. But that's easier said than done. These programs have not been taken to scale. It's not clear they could be taken to scale. And so, really the challenge is finding ways of, and the commitment to try to take these to scale and to see what you might be able to do in terms of preschool. But I think the payoff might be in helping many children. That's what I have to say.
Thank you.
So one issue is trying to improve the quality, trying to improve the standardization of all of Head Start programs. Another issue with Head Start, and this is a political issue that I have some passing familiarity with, but I don't understand the deep issue, is a lot of states run preschool programs, which I think many people would believe may be of better quality. And also the states, that's where the real money is. So a lot of states are running their own preschool programs. That's where a lot of the money is. And for some reason, the Head Start people don't talk to the state people at all. And I think that it would be worthwhile, and this is really controversial, I wrote a policy brief with my colleague Paul Haskins from Brookings on this. I think it would be very worthwhile to experiment with allowing states to commingle these funds in order to improve the quality of these preschool programs by a lot. Because I think that's the only way we can really improve Head Start and get some real money into it, is by tapping other sources of revenue, and I think the states are the answer. I don't know how well it would work. This is a very politically charged issue because the Head Start institution is very strong, and there are probably some very real concerns as well. But personally, I'd like to see some experimentation there as well. There are also, I focused on academic outcomes. Head Start is housed in HHS. And so by housing it in HHS and Health and Human Services and not in the Department of Education, that's an explicit decision to focus on other aspects of the children. So I don't know if academic outcomes might improve it, or if it were focused more on academic outcomes than it comes.
If you look at the history of the eugenics movement in this country, you can't help but have a real healthy skepticism for the kind of testing that you're looking at. Jay Gould's book is a classic on why you shouldn't trust SATs and things like that. Can you give me any reason why minority parents who have no reason to trust the government or the educational system should trust their kids to these kinds of programs?
I think that there are two different issues, right? So one is how valid are the tests themselves on telling us how well the kids are doing? And I think that is a bit of an open question. I sort of gave you some of the arguments for why the testing community thinks that there are racial and ethnic bias in the test. But, far be it for me to argue that there's none. And Claude Steele has done some really interesting work with college kids suggesting that, okay, even if the tests aren't racially biased, because of the students' own anxiety about their test taking, that can generate some of these test score gaps. Now, whether 5-year-olds have those same anxieties, I don't know, but it really does suggest that the social situation in which children take tests could influence how well they perform. So I think that's one issue. The second issue is whether, minority parents are going to sort of trust the man, are going to trust the establishment in educating their children or influencing them. From what I understand of these programs is they go over very well, and I think the parents are happy to participate. I don't want to go too far.
Again, it seems to me there's a lot of historic reason why those parents ought not to trust the establishment.
I think that's right as well. Chicago CPC, I think, was started by an African-American woman. So I don't, these are not all just kind of sort of coming from the establishment sorts of programs.
You mentioned here that the challenge is to find ways to increase funding. How does the Chapel Hill get all its money? Where does it source? I think it was mostly privately funded. I'm not saying that there wasn't any. NIH probably had some money involved as well, but I think they probably raised a lot of it through grants. So it's not part of a regular state-run program or part of a funding agency. It was an explicit study to see, well, can we make a difference with children if we start early? And how about the other two?
The other two as well. Although I think the Chicago Parent-Child Center exists, I shouldn't say. I think they exist today and are still running. And my bet is they sort of cobble together private and public funding, but I don't truly know. But they're not part of the Head Start establishment, but they're not part of the state system either.
This is probably not related to your main point for tonight, but I was struck by the bar chart in your second transparency that showed a comparison of 3 groups of children, I think, maybe 4, white, Hispanic, African American, and Asian. And you were comparing the percentage who achieved at grade level. And for the Asian children, the percentage who achieved at grade level, I think, was higher than for
it was 34.7.
and then that value dropped in comparing 3rd or 4th grade to.
That was from the eighth.
The second one.
And either the problem with PowerPoint, we have to go all the way back.
Yeah, it was,
I think it was the
yeah, that was.
That's if you look at the Asian, it's just reversed from everything else.
Right, that the proportion of Asian Americans who are performing at or above proficiency drop between 4th and 12th. I have not studied this, but I think that's
I mean, that comparison was, I think, very impressive when I looked at it, and I just wonder if there's any explanation for it.
I have not heard of any. I don't think people have paid a lot of attention. I had never actually seen these cohorts put together like this myself until I tried to do it for this talk, and I'm a little fascinated by them myself.
That was all.
Yeah, what's your take on the effectiveness of the potential effectiveness of No Child Left Behind when the reality is that it's an unfunded mandate and, you know, there are a lot of other realities too.
No Child Left Behind is the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And as we all know, it's been very controversial for a couple of reasons. One is it put into place mandatory yearly testing of students in grades, essentially grades 3 through 10. And it also established that schools had to meet, had to be making adequate yearly progress. So schools had to set a bar of by, I think, year 2011, 2013. All students are supposed to be at or above proficient, and schools had to be making progress along some timeline to get there that was established by the states. So the question is whether I think this is going to make a difference. I should also add there's another component to this, which is schools have to be doing this not only overall, but for each of several subgroups. So the schools that are more integrated have more bars that they have to get over. And it's that element of it that makes me a little queasy. So will No Child Left Behind really make a big dent in these? I doubt it. It certainly has the education world scurrying to try to do better and educate differently. At the same time, one problem with any incentives, any accountability system with incentives, is that people start to respond to the incentives. So you have schools that are saying, for example, well, in order to get our to make adequate yearly progress for our African American students, we know we have to get 3 more students to score above this particular score, and how can we get those 3 students? You know, they actually try to identify the students and get them above. And there are other ways in which they can try to game the system. So I think we have to see how that plays out. There are sanctions that go along with schools not achieving adequate yearly progress. So one of them, for example, is if the school doesn't make adequate yearly progress, the students have to be eligible to attend another public school that's doing better in the district. And in most of the districts where there are big problems,